an angry book. Certainly it's more angry than the first volume of Out of the Shadows. Perhaps because we've explored the lives and stories of Bible women we avoided in volume 1, because they're so challenging. Perhaps because the previous book was largely written during the COVID pandemic, when many hoped things would not go back to the way they were. Perhaps because we live in an age where influencers like Andrew Tate allegedly encourage men not only to rape women, but to enslave them. And perhaps because we live in a world where some public figures, including some church leaders, collaborate to hide the misdeeds of male colleagues against women. So that was the background to Kate and I have worked together on both of those books, and most of us made it sometimes sworn at each other, mainly her at me. But Kate's going to change gear a little bit and then give an example of how she might preach one of the stories, I think. So over to you, Kate. Oh, let me not trip the wire.
So, I'm speaking about the age and body. Look at me. But we do live in an age that worships youth, with some interesting results in the world of plastic surgery and Botox. But what has happened to the celebration of age, wisdom, and wrinkles? Aging is normal and necessary, and it brings its own gifts and a few challenges. Swollen ankles and minuscule bladder, anyone? On which note, do feel free to bail out the facilities. Apparently the gents' toilets are open. Anyway. I just want to look today at two of Luke's women, definitely older women, Elizabeth and Anna. But and see what we might be able to learn from Luke about the aged body, or the aging body. So we start with Elizabeth. Just lob out, what do you know about Elizabeth? What can you remember? We're not going to troll through the pages of Scripture, because Scripture's embedded in you. So lob it out, what do you know about Elizabeth?
Mary's cousin.
Hey?
Mary's cousin.
Mary's cousin, top one, anyone else?
Childless.
She was childless, yes?
Wife of Zechariah.
Yep, wife of Zechariah.
Mother
Mother of John the Baptist. Good. Anything else?
Old.
Say again?
Old.
Yeah, she was knocking on a bit, yeah? She's married to Zechariah. We're told she's a descendant of Aaron, interestingly. Her name can mean pledged to God, or my God is abundance. Interesting name. She was a deeply faithful woman. Both Zechariah and Elizabeth are described as righteous before God, living blamelessly according to their commitments and regulations of the Lord. But there's a big but, which you've named. Elizabeth is described as being barren. That's a terrible word. Sterile, cold, clinical word. And you notice the text assumes that the problem is Elizabeth's. She's the cause of the generative failure, just as with Isaac's wife Rebecca. It is Elizabeth who is barren. She's the problem, the opposite of fruitful. Barren is a dried up twig of a word. And even if the issue, or lack of issue, does lie with Elizabeth, and with no evidence for this blame for a lack of fertility is harsh and hard. We know that she's an older woman, since Zechariah tells Gabriel, when he kind of encounters Gabriel in the temple, that both he is old and his wife is getting on in years. It's not a question that pleases Gabriel, but that's another story. But contrast that with how Elizabeth reacts when she realizes she's pregnant. This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favourably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people. What a world of pain lies behind that word disgrace. This heavy burden that she's carried and endured. How many whispered words and sad side looks has this woman had to deal with? How many patronising nods and outright blame? Every time another member of the family falls pregnant, what does she endure? In short, a world of unspoken suffering. Now these words here intrigue me. I like to get inside the text and ask questions under the surface. So there she is. Her body is older. What goes through this woman's mind when she realises what this body is going to have to endure? We tend to assume it was a simple, way joyous reaction. Cobblers. I'm not buying that at all. I think there would have been joy, of course, but mixed in with fear. Yes, the disgrace is gone, but it's been replaced with an aching back, swollen ankles, and peeing every 5 minutes. I'm suffering with that now, and I'm not pregnant. It's not Tottenham. And she spends the first 5 months of that pregnancy in seclusion. I wonder why. Was she terrified of losing that child? Of being blamed? Was she feeling hideously sick? We tend to assume that God's blessing is a wonderful thing, but this can't have been plain sailing. And thankfully, the narrator leaves our Elizabeth in peace for a bit and puts the spotlight on Mary and the Annunciation. Gabriel tells Mary, if you remember, of Elizabeth's conception. This is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren, that word again. Isn't it interesting that the very first thing Mary does is head to the hills to be with Elizabeth? A picture of a younger woman seeking companionship with an older woman. And you'll remember the visitation, that meeting that was marked by Elizabeth's awareness of the physicality of the child she's bearing and the spiritual ramifications of this. Elizabeth then gives the first of a series of prophecies in the opening section of Luke's Gospel that precede actually the words of Mary, of Zechariah, of Simeon and of Anna. And her words, I think, are worth close analysis. Then Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. For why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leapt for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." Isn't it noticeable? Zechariah silenced. It's Elizabeth who utters the prophetic insight. The child leaps within her womb, and yes, of course, such prenatal movement is common, but it's Elizabeth's interpretation of this that's prophetic. The implication is that the unborn John is acknowledging the presence of the unborn Jesus, the one who, as we've heard today, will become Messiah through his life. And finally, Elizabeth praises Mary's faith in believing the words of Gabriel. Now, step inside the story. There's something remarkable going on here that we miss if we just read on like, oh, I've heard it all before. What is most striking here is the character of Elizabeth. Another woman might have rushed out of the house full of her own news, but Elizabeth's words are centred on Mary. She looks out to the other and on her own child's response within her body. Here is a woman of profound spiritual sensitivity and deep theological faith and depth. In this exchange, we have an instructive reminder to anyone who might be tempted to write off the domestic world of pregnancy, birth, motherhood as somehow less important to God than the operation of faith through the hierarchical structures of religious power and order. At the very inception of the gospel narrative, we find a domestic exchange between women, the elder and the younger, together far off from the centres of power. They're in the hill country. This scene is as redolent with the presence of God as the temple scene with Zechariah earlier. But God will not be walled up in the bricks and mortar of religious buildings and institutions, and I find that so encouraging. And you notice too how at the outset the aged body of Elizabeth is not written off. Far from it. Her body is part of God's powerful revelation of life and possibility. That is so countercultural. Those of us who are getting a bit longer in the tooth, we kind of, the world of power, it would seem, has passed us all by. We're just aging off into the sunset or to become dust in a library. Not so, says God. There's something here that critiques the contemporary quest for youth and flawless beauty. Elizabeth's wrinkles trace the possibility of God's creative grace and goodness. Her years of faith offer a shelter for Mary and an affirmation of the truth that she carries. Her age and her wisdom are vital to Mary. So, aged and aging bodies, don't knock them in any way. So there's some thoughts to ponder on Elizabeth, but I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to move on to Anna. Tell me what you know about Anna.
Prophetess in the temple.
She was described as a prophetess. Interesting prophetess, prophet. I call her a prophet, but yeah. She was
Wise.
She was wise.
She was widow.
She was a widow.
Waiting for the coming of the Lord.
She was waiting and watching, wasn't she, in those temple courts? Something else.
Obedient.
She was present. She was obedient. She was responsive.
Speaking to Maribel again because she's lost her voice. She was always in charge, Maribel said.
She was in charge. She is, isn't she? She only gets 3 verses in Scripture. But if we squeeze those verses, there is so much that will come out. Yeah.
One thing that sort of surprised me in the text is we get Simeon's words. But we're not told what she said.
We're not told.
And why do we not, I don't know, why do we not get told when we get told what Simeon said?
That's really interesting. And we'll kind of look at that and unpack it. But I suppose you could say, if someone often speaks and often has a role, you don't necessarily record everything they say. I wonder, of Simeon and Anna, which one was the religious leader? Which one? And there's evidence in the text that would suggest that she had a gathered community around her and was a regular preacher. We're going to get to that in a minute, that's a great question. So, she features just once in the Bible. At first glance, her role looks like a minor walk-on part, just 3 verses at the end of the accounts of the presentation of the infant Jesus in the temple. Anna enters the scene after Simeon's momentous prayer, in which he states, "My eyes have seen your salvation," etc., etc., whilst he's cradling this child, this light for revelation. Anna's part is brief, but it's profoundly significant. Her presence alongside Simeon mirrors the female-male pairing of Elizabeth and Zachariah, Mary and Joseph, earlier in Luke. Just as Elizabeth confirms Zachariah's naming of John in solidarity with Gabriel's command, so Anna's words and presence confirm and amplify Simeon's prayer as she speaks about the child to all who are looking for the redemption of Israel. Luke paints a picture of men and women working together within the divine purpose, and Luke's account implicitly picks up the promise of Joel 2, later referenced explicitly in Acts 2. Then afterwards I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men dream dreams, your young men see visions. Luke describes Anna as a prophet, the daughter of Phanuel. She exemplifies the prophesying daughter promised in Joel, which points towards the outpouring of the Spirit in Pentecost. Anna is in a pivotal place between the Old Testament prophecy and its fulfillment. This elderly woman demonstrates the significant role of women in discerning, confirming, and expressing the true significance of Jesus. If you remember, she was described as being of the tribe of Asher, and she was a great age. And the text said she lived with her husband She lived with her husband for 7 years after her marriage, and then as a widow to the age of 84. That's more about that later. She's potentially 105, depending on how you do the maths. Asher was one of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, which fell to Assyria in 722 BC. They were known as the Lost Tribes, probably largely assimilated or wiped out in the exile. However, the fact that Anna remains and can trace her lineage to this tribe suggests that a remnant survived, a thread who remained faithful to God. Anna isn't lost. In blessing the tribe of Asher, Moses had said, "Most blessed be the sons," brackets, daughters, "of Asher. May he be the favourite of his brothers," brackets, sisters, "and may she dip his foot in oil," etc., etc. The name Asher means happy, with connotations of blessed. And Anna's life embodies this blessing. The reference to oil picks up inferences, resonances of joy. The oil of joy of Psalm 45. Isaiah 61's oil of gladness. So this woman, this Anna, who has known grief, has not been consumed by it. She's walked her path of commitment and found blessing. She is outward focused, alert to the great significance of the moments that she lives in. And just a bit about her great age. Well, depending on how we read the text, she was either an 84-year-old widow or she was widowed for 84 years. If she was widowed for 84 years, she'd probably been married about 14. She was married till she was then 21. That would make her 105. That's a great age. But in our society, 84-year-old women, on the whole, aren't seen. And as for 105, well, you might get a mention when you get your letter, but that's about it. But there's Anna, this source of blessing. She's named as the daughter of Phanuel, rather than as somebody's wife, which means it's highly unlikely that after her early widowhood, she married again, and there's no mention of children. So Anna lived in a culture where marriage and childbearing were the source of identity and security for women. And we see that in the way that the text records Elizabeth's response to having her disgrace removed. Anna, though, is a woman of grace and a woman of favour, but she finds favour in a different way, not through the generativity of childbirth, but she is a highly generative woman. If you think about her story and try and get inside it, so she's widowed when she's quite young. That could have left her full of grief and bitterness and sorrow, resignation, stagnation. But her life, as we read it here, suggests one of dedication and focus. She's a prophet. This is her primary identity. And just notice, if you went to a group of people and said, "Tell me about prophets in the New Testament," most of them would dive in with John the Baptist. But actually, before John the Baptist is even born, is even a twinkle, there she is. There is Anna, who recognises the signs of her time and interprets them. What else do we know about her? She never left the temple, but worshipped there with fasting and prayer night and day. This is a woman who's actively cooperating with God. Maybe her grief has contributed to the formation of a sensitive and searching spirit. We don't know. And how are we to understand the idea that she never left the temple? I can't imagine anything worse than never leaving church. What does it mean? Is it figurative? And does it mean she's a highly devoted, dedicated woman? Or did she actually literally sleep in the temple environs? It's quite possible she did. There was this secular temple guard who lived on site. Around the court of women, there would have been storerooms where they kept oil, wine, wood, musical instruments. Did she live in one of those spaces? Was she effectively homeless? It just changes the way you read it when you start to step in and imagine. Her freedom then from family life, is that what allows for her to have such single-minded focus? This picture, I absolutely love it. This is Rembrandt's painting, Old Woman Reading, which is thought to be the prophet Anna. It captures a sense of focus as she pores over the book. The light from an unknown source comes from behind, bathing her and illuminating the page where her wrinkled hand traces the words, a suggestion of a woman intent upon, focused on God. And she's bold. She praises God publicly and she teaches about Jesus. She addresses those who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. Now ask yourself the question. This woman, what? She just suddenly appears, stage left, and seems to know who's looking for the redemption of Jerusalem, as if by magic. Absolute cobblers. She knew who they were because she engaged with them. And I think behind this intriguing snippet, we can discern something about her life in the temple, where she shares with others, she worships with others, she reflects with those who are waiting expectantly for a renewal of Israel's spiritual life. Luke paints us a picture of an elderly woman preaching to a gathered group with a shared interest. Messianic expectation was at an all-time high in the 1st century. Anna is part of a community. Anna is a leader. And she's hidden away. And we don't really say much about her. But I think she is utterly remarkable. What I want to do now is to just offer you, in the last bit, a suggestion of how we might use Anna's story to take us into a subject that's pretty relevant today. So, the Beatles' haunting song, Eleanor Rigby, asks the question, where all the lonely people come from and where do they all belong? The first verse focuses on a woman in a church clearing up confetti after a wedding. She stands outside the circle of celebration. She's just a bit part in someone else's story. This lyric presents an aching picture of loneliness. Eleanor putting her face on as she goes out of the door, presenting a very different reality to the world outside. And the song shifts and focuses then on Father Mackenzie working on a sermon no congregation will hear and darning his socks alone. He is the only person present at the burial of Eleanor Rigby. It is a singularly moving song that speaks of chronic loneliness. And that's not a topic we often speak about. It's almost shameful. Loneliness is an aspect of our human experience that we all face from time to time, and it is so much more than being alone. That state of chronic isolation, of spiritual isolation, physical isolation. 2018, Age Concern UK did some research and estimated that by 2026 there'll be over 2 million over 50s in England who will feel lonely. And they add this, and I quote, the risk of being often lonely is dramatically higher among people who are widowed or do not have someone to open up to. And that research was before the trauma and isolation of the pandemic, so it's likely the figure is much, much higher. The cure for loneliness is connection, meaningful conversation, belonging to a community, having significance, having connection. Luke only gives us a wee snippet about Anna, yet it communicates much about her experience of meaningful conversation, her membership of a community, and her worth and significance. We can see much in the life of this elderly woman to help us as we reflect on loneliness, its causes and its remedies. I've mentioned this bit. The next bit kind of riffs on her age, so I won't repeat that. Anna stands outside the societal norms of marriage and family life in her cultural context. So superficially, and I realise this is a connection you'll never hear made again, Eleanor Rigby and Anna the prophet are very similar. Superficially, they're both single women, they're both connected to places of worship, but the similarity ends there. Eleanor Rigby embodies profound loneliness. Where are her meaningful conversations, her community, her significance? There's just an empty space. In contrast, we see Anna in profound conversation, embedded in community, human and divine. She begins to speak about the child to all looking for the redemption of Israel. It's not randomness. It's not too great a stretch to say that she knew her audience. She knew them well. And Anna is a woman deeply connected to God. And Luke confirms her significance when he tells her that she's a prophet. The spectre of loneliness that we might expect to have been a feature of Anna's life is thwarted by key factors. She knows her roots. She's of the tribe of Asher. She has rich conversation. She is in community with God and others. And her role as a prophet gives meaning to her life. A meaning that becomes crystallised as she gazes on the child. Question then, how do we combat loneliness, whether in ourselves or others? It's amplified, isn't it, when people's experience of church is just a gathering of individuals who sit siloed in cold pews for an hour a week. No thanks. The genuine community of faith is a messy place where all are welcome. All are welcome. Not just the young, bright, shiny couple with 2.3 kids. They are, of course, welcome. But it's where everyone is welcome and everyone is seen. And how do we do that? We have to shape that and form it and make it happen. A place where people come together and find meaning, companionship and belonging and worth. A place where gifts are discovered and named and known and celebrated. Such communities vanquish the shadows of chronic loneliness. And then the hope that Anna saw in Christ is born again. What we tended to do with the sermons that we wrote in the book is finish with a kind of collect that we wrote for each of the women. So I'd like to pray, if that's okay, the collect at the end of that reflection. God of life, we give you thanks for Anna, this elderly widow full of life and light. Thank you for her focus, her witness to the value of age and wisdom. In her story, we see the importance of deep conversation, community, and significance conferred. Enable your church to offer this warmth to all seeking shelter from the chill of loneliness. Amen. And just as an addendum to that, I'm minded to add that the loneliness carried by many of us in this room is amplified by the way the church has treated us. And I think that's why these kind of gatherings are so crucial, because we see the worth of one another reflected in each other's eyes and create a sense of solidarity. And that's all I have to say. At the end. Well, we'll do the questioning of both of us at the end, and then I can hide behind her. It gives you a bit more time as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce a woman who really needs no introduction, but I've got the mic now. Our great friend Liz, and I know that we're all really grateful to Liz for pulling this together year on year on year and battling against idiots with such dedication and focus. I mean, you know her academic prowess and all of the rest of it. She's written many things and is a good egg and a small woman, and we love her, all of us. But the thing I'd like to say is, whenever I think of Liz, I'm reminded of a phrase that came to mind once when we were working with some slightly chewy situation down at, we were doing some CME for the for the Armed Forces Chaplaincy, and there were some interesting men in the room. Some lovely men in the room, and there were some interesting ones. And I watched the way that one of them asked an idiotic question, and I watched Liz answer it, and I thought, yeah, that's Liz in her, what's it, smiling Mancunian assassin role. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the smiling Mancunian assassin.
Thank you very much. I'll try not to assassinate anybody. I wonder how you felt a fortnight ago yesterday when the name of the next Archbishop of Canterbury was announced. Initially, I felt really hopeful. It's a woman after all. And then I thought about what the Church traditionally and consistently does to women. And I fear for her. I'm told that women, before they get into positions of power in the Church, say very good things. And then when they are in the positions of power, they do as they're told. Some of you will have heard me say this before. In 2016, John Chalmers, who was then the moderator of the Church of Scotland, said that the next 10 years would be a decade of fighting for gender justice. That finishes next year, and it feels as though we're losing, to be honest. Sky News managed to announce the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury without naming her, although by the second line we did, thank goodness, know about her husband, which is the important bit after all. And it took no time at all before people began to ask, but what will the Conservative Evangelicals do? Or what will the Catholics do? Or what will GAFCON say? What about them? Sarah's body was being problematised rather than her skills or suitability for the role. And if you're sitting there at the moment thinking, thank God I'm not an Anglican, then perhaps I could point you in the direction of Project Violet, which is the Baptist Church's very own Aren't We a Bunch of Idiotic Patriarchs document. It's research into the way that women are treated by the Baptist Church, which is not dissimilar from the way women are treated by the Anglican Church. Gosh, there's a surprise. We heard earlier it's 30 years since the first women were ordained. It's actually 50 years since General Synod decided that there are no fundamental objections to the ordination of women. And yet for 20 years, they managed to find enough objections to kick the can down the road. Which it seems to me is precisely what the House of Bishops have done this week on issues of same-sex relationships. You may know that Watch, Women in the Church, have been campaigning for transparency. It doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Please can you tell us where your church stands on the issue of women's ministry? But churches won't do it. In fact, the Bishop of Ebbsfleet, Rob Monroe, hurrah, the flying bishop for the Conservative Evangelicals, commented that transparency is not a major issue. In fact, it's a secondary issue that is not worthy his attention. And yet 50 years ago, the then Bishop of Winchester, John Taylor, said, are we once again to decide, for the sake of unity and an unrocked boat, that it's inexpedient to take any action? And the answer has been yes, time and time and time again. In my research, it was fascinating and distressing to realise how often church authorities used women's bodies against them. Shouldn't you wait till you've had a family before you go for ordination to someone who wasn't even engaged? Or from a church warden to a new curate. Will you tell me when you're on your period, because I don't want to take communion from you at that time? You might remember the story of the woman who anoints Jesus' feet at Simon the Pharisee's house in Luke 7. Traditional Bible teachers, of course, want her to be a prostitute because however would she have any money to buy expensive ointment if she wasn't a prostitute? And the Pharisee wants Jesus to condemn her. But Jesus says this: do you see this woman? Do you see this woman? And that's one of the important things about this conference and others like it that Kate and I do. We try to see the experiences and the faith of women. I thought about the ways in which churches and our training institutions control women's bodies and the narrative around women's bodies, and here are some of them, and you'll recognise them. In the curriculum, there's theology, and then there's a subsection called feminist theology. In the library, there are theological books and a smaller section called feminism, or feminist theological books. And the heroes of the faith that we constantly are told about are the men. Our forerunners, the people that we're supposed to empathise with, are men. And that's important because one of the things that the patriarchal church has done is make it seem as though the Bible is irrelevant to us. It's stolen our heritage. And one of the things that I'm convinced about, and it's what Kate and I have been working on, is reclaiming the heritage of women from Scripture for the benefit of people who sit in the pews, who read the Bibles on a regular basis, who want to know what women have experienced in the past and who can we look to for some encouragement. One of the things that Archbishop Designate Sarah said earlier this year at the Women's Voices Conference in London is that here, among other women, we can find our voice. And here we can drink at the well of resurrection hope. Telling our own story is powerful. In the last few weeks, I've been to hear both President Barack Obama and Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham. That is actually go and sit on a chair, not look on a screen and listen in. And they both talked about the importance of knowing our stories, knowing where we come from, knowing our heritage, being able to talk about the people who've gone before us and done similar things to the ones that we're trying to do. Stories of our foremothers, the women who stepped into new spaces, who lead by example and who changed their worlds. There are women whose bodies were exploited, stricken, expelled, and objectified. But there are also women who resisted and who changed the times. But I want to start with Hagar. Hagar's story is predicated on one thing. That's the importance of being seen. Being seen as anything other than a commodity. Being seen as a person. If you remember the story, Hagar is Sarah's slave. She's Abraham's handy means of reproduction when Sarah can't do what wives are supposed to do. And she's Ishmael's mother. Problematically, even God doesn't call Hagar by her name. When speaking to Abraham, God calls her your slave woman. She's the surrogate, the chattel, the pawn. When she flees her mistress's abuse, pregnant and alone, God sees her and promises that the cries of her affliction have been heard. But it doesn't seem as though they could have been, because the story forces her into the stereotypical role. God sends her back The Victorians love this. God sends her back to slavery. You're in slavery, get back to where you belong. That's terrible. That's not a kind of God I'm interested in, really. And the promise to her of God's blessing is that she's going to have a son. The second time she flees, we're told it's not her cries that God hears, it's the boy's cries. I've occasionally sat with steam literally coming out of my ears, I'm sure, when I've read essays from students that say, well, it's all right because we needed the boy to be the other son for Abraham, didn't we? No. Hagar's body is used and abused, commodified and forced to run. It's unseen as a person. It's a dark story. It's oppression based on gender and race, and it's normalised. Hagar's black female body is used and abused. And yet, there is an and yet, she has agency. For it's this woman, the lowest of the low, who's the first person in the Bible to name God. And the name that she gives to God is the one who sees. And some of the things that we heard this morning were really important because it was naming God for ourselves. Let's not take on other people's ideas of who God is, what resurrection is, what incarnation is. Let's name that for ourselves. The next person I've been engaging with her and reading about her for a while is Miriam. Miriam's body is afflicted, allegedly by God, because she raises a question. And the question actually is a question of justice and of truth. And yet, she's made unseen. Her body is afflicted in order to protect the status quo. And when Moses and apparently God are angered by her temerity, she's given leprosy. But let's think about Miriam. She's a great woman. She's got a good track record. She was possibly one of the midwives in the book of Exodus who refused to do what Pharaoh commanded and to kill the Hebrew boys at birth and made sure that they lived and came up with a brilliant excuse that they're all born so healthy that they get born too quickly or whatever it was. And then she goes on and she helps her mum to hide the infant Moses until, of course, he gets too big and noisy, like most kids do, to hide any longer. And then she helps her mum come up with this plan to hide Moses in the bulrushes, where Pharaoh's daughter will find him. And when the princess of Egypt does find the baby, Miriam suggests, well, you'll need a wet nurse, won't you? I know a really good one. And recruits Moses' own mother to be his wet nurse. It's a cracking story. That's why Disney picked it. Miriam is clever and strategic. She shows all the signs of being a good leader. But like a good girl, she stays out of the limelight, unseen. And in this part of the story, unnamed too. But later on, when Moses is in his 80s, he's given 2 helpers to lead the people of Israel, Aaron and Miriam, co-leaders of the Hebrews. So Miriam must have been about 90. Going back to the old women, they were great. And God calls Miriam a prophet. The first person in the Old Testament to be called a prophet is Miriam. And when the people are led out of slavery in Egypt, we read that Moses leads them, but Miriam leads the women. Miriam leads the women singing, dancing, and playing tambourines. And I think that's important. Why would Miriam lead the women out of slavery? I think it's because women's slavery was different from men's slavery. Men were forced to work outside to make bricks without straw, to build pyramids. They were whipped if they didn't build fast enough. But the women worked in the household, frequently naked or semi-naked, and fair game for any man who wanted to assault or rape them. It was a different kind of slavery, and it needed a woman to lead them out of that slavery. Miriam understands the women, and she's equal to Moses in leadership. But then we come to this really awkward story in Numbers chapter 12. This is what we're told. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he married. Actually, in the Hebrew, the verbs are all feminine singular. It wasn't Miriam and Aaron who spoke, it was Miriam who spoke. And she said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through me also?" Well, God's already called Miriam a prophet, so the answer must be yes. God has already spoken through Miriam. And then we get this interesting little bit of the story, which I think is editorial. The Lord heard it, and suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." So the three of them go out. There's no sign of anybody being worried about meeting God in this meeting, by the way. There's no sign of Miriam shuffling and looking embarrassed or being scared or making an excuse that she was postmenopausal and needed to knit to the loom. Nothing like that. They just go. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both come forward. And then God says, of course God does, some flattering things about Moses, and asks them, probably Miriam, "Why then weren't you afraid to talk against my servant Moses?" And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Miriam. And he went, and when the cloud went away from the tent, Miriam's skin had become diseased, as white as snow. And Aaron turned towards Miriam and saw that she was diseased. And then Aaron said to Moses, "Oh my Lord, do not punish us." Interesting that. Aaron doesn't turn to God and say, "Don't punish us." Aaron turns to Moses and says, "Don't punish us for a sin that we've so foolishly committed," said he who wasn't involved. "Don't let her be like one stillborn, whose flesh is half consumed when it comes out of its mother's womb." So Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days. And listen to this bit. The people did not set out on the march until Miriam had been brought in again. The people recognized that Miriam was an important leader for their mission. Well, you know the most common interpretation of the story, I'm sure, that Miriam tells Moses off when she's got no right to, because he's a man, and she tells him off for marrying a foreign Cushite woman. Miriam is being uppity and racist, in other words, and so she deserves to get the leprosy that God apparently gives her. It's interesting that the story is used to silence people in churches, because leaders are God appointed and therefore irreproachable. And if you question your leader, then you're not having faith in God. But some obvious questions occurred to me about who's the Cushite wife anyway? And what might Miriam have been saying? Well, Moses does marry a Cushite woman. She's called Zipporah. And Zipporah's body too is a commodity. Her father gave her to Moses. We don't know why or in exchange for what. And then there's a really weird story that you may not have read, where Moses and Zipporah and their son are travelling, goodness knows where or from. And suddenly God gets cross. I don't know whether he'd had a bad curry the night before or whatever it was, but God decides to kill one of them, one of the men. Don't know which one, it's not clear. And Zipporah ends up circumcising one or other of them, again not clear, and God relents. It's in Exodus 4. It's a really weird story, but the fact is that Moses' life has been saved by this woman, Zipporah, this Cushite wife. Again. And yet, the marriage between Moses and Zipporah stands out among early biblical marriages because Moses sends her back to her father. He's too busy. He's a leader chosen by God who doesn't have time for his wife. Where have we heard that before? Which is not an unfamiliar story. Could it be that Miriam raises this with him? You know how you've got a wife and you're not paying her any attention and and you sent her away, and that's not what we're supposed to do. Having led women out of Egypt, where their bodies were vulnerable and abused, could Miriam have noticed that her brother was doing something similar to Zipporah and raised the issue with him? Well, Miriam's body, we're told, is afflicted with leprosy. Only Aaron and Moses see this. Ding ding, alarm bells. Only Aaron and Moses see this because she's sent out of the camp. And when she returns, there's no sign of leprosy. Interesting. So who told the people that Miriam had been given leprosy for challenging the leadership? Who did tell the people that Miriam had been given leprosy for challenging the leadership? It must have been the leader who'd been challenged, wasn't it? How convenient that a woman challenging the system has to be sent out of sight. If you want to check this out, there's a great book called Silenced Women, Why the Law Fails Women and How to Fight Back by Jennifer Robinson and Kina Yoshida. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sex Equality reported in 2018 that women in the UK face multiple discrimination. They become invisible, and that discrimination is based on colour, race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, and more. Women's bodies are hidden in the statistics because they're inconvenient. Women have often been called the canaries in the coal mine. Before the invention of poison gas monitors, coal miners used to take canaries down the mines with them because they're more sensitive than human beings, and the canaries would either show signs of distress or die if poisonous gas was present, and the miners would know to get out. MP Jess Phillips argues that women are canaries in the coal mine in terms of society in general and specific issues in particular. We largely ignore domestic violence. Recently, the rate of domestic violence incidents has fallen, but not because there are fewer incidents, because we count them differently. And Jess Phillips points out that if domestic violence and sex crime against women had been taken seriously, terrorist attacks on London Bridge, Manchester, Westminster, Finsbury Park, and possibly the attack on the synagogue in Manchester last week, the week before, might have been prevented. Because the perpetrators of each of those incidents all had histories of violence against women. Selena Stone, in the book that's on the bookstall, A Heavy Yoke, points out that women in our churches who are deemed to be making a fuss are also ignored and silenced, and might actually be canaries in the coal mine, warning that toxic gas is filling our churches. Male authority is often used to suppress reports of domestic violence, we've heard that already today, and other instances of sexism. Ellen Blue, an American professor, comments that while virtually no newly ordained man will be told that someone liked his little sermon, that kind of comment is not unfamiliar to women. Kate was doing me saying this. Kate was sharing one over lunch about somebody picking up the book that she had written and said, oh, not bad. Same sort of thing. We read about these occurrences in Scripture. I told you earlier about the Durham Common Awards research I did where women wanted to get together to talk about the way things really are. And it works. And we've got scriptural stories that show it works. Remember the story of Rachel and Leah? Remember the bit about the mandrakes? Let me tell you. And watch the way their bodies are used, but they also use their bodies to resist, because they want to get onto some sort of hopeful things. Yeah. Leah is unwanted by Jacob, but thrust on him by her scheming father. Rachel is so loved by Jacob that he works another 7 years for her, so 14 years of free labour to get Rachel as his wife. Of course, a wife's job is to have babies, and so Leah and Rachel enter a competition, a baby competition, and Leah pulls ahead. So Rachel gives her maid to Jacob, and she gives him 2 sons, and Leah follows the example and gives her maid to Jacob too, and the competition is so intense that Rachel actually says in Genesis 30 verse 8 that she's wrestling with her sister. But then the story takes this really interesting turn, and this is where I think it's important. During the harvest time, one of Leah's sons, Reuben, finds some mandrakes. Mandrakes, if you don't know, are plants that are common around the Mediterranean. They're quite often used in folk medicine. And among other things, they're supposed to bestow fertility. So Leah's walking through the field with these mandrakes, and Rachel meets her. And Rachel says, "Can I have some of your mandrakes?" Well, the exchange with the sisters is short and frank. Leah tells Rachel that she's taken away her husband and now she wants to take the mandrakes, and Rachel kind of says, "Yeah, that's right." She seems to agree. But then there's an interesting deal, which is a bit like the deal that Jacob and Laban and other men before them have done. They come to an agreement. Leah can have the night with Jacob, and Rachel can have some mandrakes. A night with the guy for some mandrakes. It seems trivial and weird in our culture, but it also seems to be empowering, because in this bartering, the women are behaving as the menfolk have done previously, and instead of being subject to this bartering, they're bartering for Jacob. So when Jacob returns from work that evening, Leah says to him something like what was probably said to her many a time: "You're with me tonight, I bought you." And things change. And when conflict arises between Jacob and Laban's sons, and Jacob realises it's time to move on, he asks his wives what to do. Where we're told that the previous guys, Abraham took Sarah, Isaac took Rebecca, Jacob consults with his wives. That's empowering too. And then the women do an interesting thing. They begin to talk about their previous experience, how they've been treated. Usually the Bible talks about husbands buying wives, but here, these 2 women say that their father sold them. The bodies were nothing more than merchandise, even to the father. In this conversation, the women name their pain, and in so doing they begin to claim a sense of meaning and a sense of authority over their own lives. And then we get this really interesting bit that follows. They run away, and Rachel decides to steal her father's teraphim. That's some kind of status-giving ornament. It might be a family god or something that links to ancestors. We don't really know. Maybe she felt that her father had loved them more than he loved her, but she decides to steal them anyway. And they're so important to Laban that he chases after Jacob and his daughters to get them back. And when he catches them, Jacob resorts to the fully fledged patriarch and threatens to kill whoever's taken them. But Rachel has hidden the teraphim in a camel's saddlebag. And when her father comes rampaging through the camp, she simply sits down. She sits on the bag, and then she tells him that she's menstruating and she can't move. And that's all it takes. Like the guy asking the woman curate I was talking about earlier. Laban stops in his tracks and backs off, because women's blood is dangerous. Where men's blood is supposed to be salvific, women's blood is polluting, but actually women's blood is dangerous. And women working together are powerful. That's what this story seems to indicate. Women working together are powerful, and I think that's true. That's why, for so many reasons, in my research, women enjoy being together. They could talk about the way the church really is. They could talk about lectures that seem to diminish their status as students and learners. They just wanted some time for them. And finally, let me introduce a fourth woman who genuinely, I think, does change the course of her people's history. That's Queen Vashti. Vashti's body was largely decorative, at least in the eyes of the king of Persia, Ahasuerus. Persia, you may know, covered modern-day Iran, and there's a Jewish population there. It's estimated that the Persian palaces contained the equivalent of $300 billion worth of precious metals in today's money. That's just over half an Elon Musk. Maybe there was even a gold ball ring. When the emperor chose a queen, he wanted a beautiful one, beautiful enough to fit in to the opulent setting. The king has a banquet at which he wanted to show off his wealth. So he holds this kind of roadshow banquet. Can you imagine this? Travels through 127 provinces of the empire, eating and drinking for 180 days. That's brilliant, isn't it? 180 days of eating and drinking. And at the end of it, he has this intimate little party for everybody that lives in Susa, the city where his palace is, which lasted 7 days. 7 days of drinking and feasting in royal gardens decked out in white and blue with couches of gold and silver to be attended by all the men of the city. And this is what the king says to them. The king gave orders for all the men of the place to do as they pleased. Again, you can imagine 21st century parallels. At the same time as the king's feast was going on, the queen also gave a banquet for women. So at the time of the story, the king is about 190 days into eating and drinking and showing off his wealth. What's left? I wonder what's left. What can he do to demonstrate how important he is now that everybody knows how much money he's got and how much power he's got? Well, there are two possibilities. Probably power or a bit more wealth. So he decides to show off his queen. A beautiful asset that points to him, wearing a dazzling crown that also points to him. Perhaps in an additional show of power, he sends not one eunuch to go and get Vashti, but 7. Imagine the scene. The king is merry with wine. He's told the men at his party to do as they please, and his message to the queen is to come to him wearing her crown, by implication, only her crown. Queen Vashti makes a bold choice, and maybe it's where we are in the church today. She decides that she will not be an asset to demonstrate masculine vanity. She will not be abused, and she refuses to do as the king has asked. The king's humiliated. The king's angry. The king's nobles are unsettled. What if she does it again? What if our wives start standing up to us? Vashti has to go. And she does. And it looks for a while as though Vashti's achieved nothing. To replace her, young virgins are rounded up and trafficked to Susa, subjected to the beauty treatments of the time, and forced to wait for the king to send for them. The king's bedroom is some kind of a sorting gate between the place of virgins and the place of the concubines, the unused and the used women. Esther's one of these women. We're told that she listens carefully to the eunuch who prepares her to go in to the king. What does one abused person tell another? I wonder. Could it be that the eunuch tells her about Vashti? Well, Esther pleases the king in the bedroom, and the story reverts to feasting and banquets and political intrigue. Meantime, elsewhere, the faithful Jew Mordecai, coincidentally Esther's uncle, refuses to bow to the king's favourite narcissist. It's also 21st century America, this.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Despite the fact that everyone else seems to bow to Haman, he returns home complaining that he's had a really bad day simply because one man didn't bow. If Haman was among those who advised the king to banish Vashti, perhaps he fears the seeds of change pushing their way through the firm ground of his privilege. But Haman's so vindictive, he decides not only to annihilate Mordecai, but to also wipe out the Jews. Mordecai finds out, goes to Esther for help. Go into the king's presence and beg for mercy for us, he asks her. And now comes the bit that if you've heard sermons on this, or if you've preached on this, you will know. Mordecai says to Esther, if you don't do this, you'll die and your family will die as well. But who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? I sometimes research sermons that are available online on texts that I'm interested in, and I did that with this one. It's striking how many of them were basically used to tell congregations to do what the preacher wanted them to do. Esther is seen as nothing more than a means of persuasion. Selina Stone, again in the book that's on the bookstall, gives an example of how preachers and leaders try to persuade women that that's their role, a supporting one, a way of usually a male leader getting his way. Here's a small part of Selina's story. She attended a Pentecostal Bible college where a man she describes as a church planter with a strong vision to build large congregations around the country went during the last few months of the academic year in an attempt to recruit talent for his enterprise. This is what she says. He invited people up to the altar for prayer. I went up enthusiastically as I was having a hard time. He began to pray. The first thing he said, which was common at the time, since once people knew I wasn't married, was that God had a husband for me. And he then asked me a series of questions about what I was planning to do after Bible college, to which I replied, I don't know. The next word he gave me was that he saw a picture of me kneeling down and washing the feet of a man of God. That as I served this man faithfully, God would make space for my own calling. It took me a while to realise he probably meant himself, as the following year he circled back to have a conversation about God's call on my life. I passed. I found my path to my calling quite well without needing to wash a man's feet. Back to Esther. Within a few sentences of Mordecai's challenge to her, we read a verse that none of the sermons, and I looked at about 20 I think, none of the sermons mention this. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So it's always told that Esther does what her uncle says because her uncle's a wise bloke. But that's not what happens at all. He goes away and does what she says. Not in any sermon. Esther's not only royal, she also has an example to follow, and someone who prepared the way for her. Vashti refused to do as the king asked, and she became a role model. What was once unthinkable has become thinkable. And where Vashti refused to go to the king, Esther goes uninvited. She's learnt what's important: food and wine. 2 dinners in as many days prompts the king to ask what Esther wants. Notice what's happened. That little bit of resistance has led to the king not shouting and going red in the face and consulting his blokes and the boys' gang, but asking Esther what she wants, noticing what she's saying. Esther's not a possession to be paraded before guests who need to be impressed. Rather, she is to be listened to. And when Esther tells the king her story, he doesn't again consult with the other nobles. He goes into the garden to think. Vashti's actions have brought about change. Refusing to allow her body to be used or abused paved the way, I believe, for Esther to be even more radical. At the end of the story, Esther commands her people. She's not an ornamental queen, she's a leading one. One of the ways in which churches silence women is by making it seem as though these women in Scripture are insignificant. They also make it seem as though when we ask for equality, i.e. having our stories told, we're being unreasonable and revolutionary. As though we're treading where no woman has trod before. But I don't believe that that's a faithful account of the biblical record that such people often claim to love. If you've ever been in one of my preaching classes, you'll know how often I point out that the first thing that happens when we stand to preach, or when we walk into a classroom, or when we speak in a meeting, is that we're seen. And we're seen as women. People's unconscious expectations begin to influence how they respond to us. And we've heard about all sorts of unconscious expectations today. Bishop Sarah said this: the fact is, often we're subversive simply by being where we are. Our bodies are seen and we are subversive. That's why, increasingly, people want to hide us. So let me suggest a few things. Firstly, if you preach or speak, stop using the flow of sermons in their tracks, the usual flow of sermons in their tracks. Like Esther, stop the flow of power. And find the voices of women in the texts. If you study the women of the Bible or feminist theology. And if you read the Bible, read the women's stories. It's been said that it's not difficult to deprive the great majority of independent thought, but the minority who will retain an inclination to criticise must be silenced. Let's refuse to be silenced, both in the church and in the country at the moment. If hope exists, it must be in our refusal to be invisible and our insistence on being seen. Days like today are places where we find our voices together and insist that we are seen. In coming together, there's hope. As Bishop Sarah said earlier this year, don't be intimidated by those with loud voices and big banners. Find your way through tears and through hope. Right, questions, etc. Okay, time for me.
Don't be intimidated
Well, let's start a bit further back. You can correct me on this if you want. What's happened since Living in Love and Faith and since women's ordination is that conservative evangelical churches, first of all, were anti-women and then became anti-LGBTQ. And now they seem to have won because the bishops have been a bit spineless, well, they're not spineless. But what they're doing is bringing together both of those cases, and I think there's going to be, from the church where the money is, the churches where the money is, there's going to be a backlash against women's ministry as well. Jenny, you're going to say something?
Yeah, it's sort of in response to a question I was asked earlier as well. I've just been looking it up. A year ago I went to a meeting just of women, amazingly, and we put together a paper to go to the House of Bishops for Gender Justice Commission along the same lines as the Racial Justice Commission, because the work of gender justice has never been done in the church. That was due to go to the House of Bishops and Archbishops Council on the 17th of September, but it's been quietly dropped. So I suppose in terms of what can we do, we can ask our bishops to push for it, because I don't think it's fair to put that on Archbishop Sarah to lead that work on her own. But we have a whole country of bishops who could be advocating for us in the House of Bishops and on Archbishop Council.
I think it's also important to realise how much hate mail, etc. Archbishop Designate Sarah has already had, and not to give her extra work to do when she's got to cope with that.
I'm just thinking about, if you think about the work of the conservative evangelicals, they're highly coordinated, and we're not. And you can't fight this individually. And I think the tendency is, against those kind of monolithic voices, when you feel just on your own, is to kind of dip your head a bit. Because we need to coordinate, we need structure, we need ways of representing our voices together. I think that for me would be a key.
Pretty much to echo that, really, because people who are inclusive are beginning to come together to organise more at the moment, to recognise the need to look at things, small p politically, really, and to count numbers and to coordinate who stands for various positions. So I think we need to be in those spaces saying, and women. But for me as well, I guess this is a Manchester Diocese thing, but what I'm noticing and getting, I find myself not going to meetings anymore, but things like deanery synods, coming like Lisa from what was the first inclusive deanery before it was abolished, they are now, the change seems to have been that it is entirely top down, as things have been reorganised within the diocese. I don't see a space where we can bring these issues to somewhere like Deanery Synod, have an open and constructive conversation, and then if that's the will of that synod, then take things up through structures. Everything comes down now. We seem to have lost that voice. How do we reclaim that voice? And how do we stop being nice? And the other one is, how do we get empower younger women to be involved in this? Because that shift to the conservative does seem to be happening with a lot of younger clergy, certainly.
When I did the research for Durham Common Awards, I asked all the training institutions whether they'd like to be involved, and one institution knows who it is now, said they didn't need it, it wasn't for them.
Which institution was that?
Emmanuel,
I just think we're always very quiet, aren't we?
Yeah.
One institution.
Yeah.
Never shame, I'm
Yeah. No, Emmanuel said, first of all, they said they would like to be involved and strung me along, and then the day before I needed to get the final group of people I was going to work with in, they said no. So then I had 24 hours to find another organisation.
One of the things that concerns me is, I don't know whether it's happening in your diocese, but we have this oversight model with vocal ministers. And oversight ministers are ministers who need to have some experience in planting new congregations.
Now, I've been doing some research into this, looking at stipendiary women clergy, like congregations. If you're a stipendiary woman in the Church of England, you are half as likely as a man to plant a new congregation. And that's going to mean that eventually you're going to be disqualified from being an oversight minister. Because you won't have the experience or the background in which to do it. If you look at the resource church model, which is quite common in charismatic and conservative evangelical churches, less common in the Anglo-Catholic side, 15% of resource churches are led by women. And you contrast that with the numbers being ordained and finding the line. And then I said, okay, let's look at the curates. How many curates in those churches? 32% of them are women that I can find. I've looked at 130 resource churches across 28 dioceses. Rick Thorpe's book on resource churches, 15% of the case studies in that book are women. And that's because that's representative. He's not trying to exclude people. It's representative of the numbers. So I know that often we don't like the conversation and the language around church planting because it is so male-centric. It's unbelievably male-centric, even more than the rest of the Church of England. But if we aren't in those spaces or taking an interest in them, that side of it, because the church has got this church growth strategy about starting all these new congregations and new worshipping communities, we're going to be left behind from that side. So I think that's also a space alongside all the other spaces in which we need to be watching, to pay attention to.
Yeah. I mean, the question I have about resource churches anyway is, isn't it just a straightforward colonial model?
Yeah. Well, you can challenge that, and we're doing that in Sheffield. We're doing it differently. So we've set up the cathedral to be a resourcing church, working with local parishes in a more incarnational way. Say, how can we help you to do the things you see growing up in your community, and looking at church plant changing. The Church of England is very unimaginative when it comes to church planting. It's taken one model from the US, the Graft model, and imposed it in a very colonial way. And we need to start pushing back with other models.
And you know what? What is it that women are really good at doing? Community. When we don't, we're really good at community. And when we don't play the competitive power games, we build networks. I've just given you a sample sermon on one of the things that is rife in our country now, which is loneliness. It can't be difficult to shape community, can it really, and to gather people. People are hungry to be loved. We all are. You know, that's a very flat structure. There is potential here to do it differently.
Can we have a good news story here? Has anybody heard of sensible shoes?
I always will, yes.
In our church we started with one group, it's 2, it's now 4 with a waiting list, 35 women going through this book, which is written by a spiritual director, based on Ignatian spirituality, but it's about 4 women and their lives and stories and what's happening in our churches. And it's spread into other churches. Now 2 other churches starting up, Catholics involved, people who don't go to church. And I started up in my previous diocese, and it's now 20 churches. You know, it's starting up again. And it's when you talk about loneliness, it really is hitting the nail on the head. And it's subversive. And I didn't ask anybody's permission. And I was talking to the bishop about it, and he was saying, "Oh, this sounds interesting." But it's under the radar. And we have got to do things, I think, under the radar. She was a prophetess, she was quiet and she was involved, and I think we can get on with it. And then,
I think you're right, but I think we need to at some point. So I absolutely agree with you. And as an aside to that, go and do any spiritual direction course. In this country, it's women who are training in spiritual direction, and there's a hunger for it. But what I think is, yes, go under the radar for a while. And then you've got to pop up and go, hang on a minute, I could be a resource minister, or you haven't founded any church. Well, actually, there's 4 over here and 5 over here, so I think you'll find Bishop Anne.
yeah,
Do you know, I
agree.
I think there needs to be some strategic
Some joining together, but this is forming a network.
But there's also something about when you do that, you start to attract attention to what you're doing. So you don't actually have to put yourself above the parapet, because you're slowly becoming more visible by what you're doing, and then that captures
think that sounds fantastic, but I think we've absolutely got to stick our heads and our whole bodies, going back today, above the parapet. I think we have to be willing to be rude, or be perceived as being rude. I think we have to be willing to be quite disruptive, and I think we have to be seen to be angry. And I'm really bad at that, partly because I tend to cry a lot. So, but when I'm angry, I'm frustrated. But we are not seen, we're not taken seriously. You can see it by who is given preferment in the church. You can see it by who's taken seriously. And by and large, it's not women. And it's real, and it's proper politics. It is, you know, I was saying to you earlier, you could, the letter that Bishop Davis sent out in Manchester, you can see the bishop, first rule of politics, learn to count. The bishops have learned to count and thought, right, we're leaving this for now. We've got to think like that. We really have. And I think, you know, the trouble is, if anybody else is like me, they're too knackered from doing the day job. We're too knackered from having more than one parish. Hardly any lay people able to take on roles anymore, etc., etc. So we don't. So we go below the radar. We do fantastic stuff locally and on the ground, and then all the really well-resourced blokes go off building their power bases in the church, and then in the future we get squeezed out because they'll plant into our churches on their model. So I've had it.
I'm Sarah, I'm from St Pancras Church down in London. We ran Women's Voices with Liz in May, and it will be Saturday, May the 9th next year. I'd love you to stick that date in your diary and come. Selina Stone will come and talk about her book. She wasn't given a platform at the Festival of Preaching. She was pushed into the plenary at the end of the day. We're giving her an hour so that she can properly speak at our conference. And there'll be other fantastic speakers as well. Karen O'Donnell coming to speak about trauma. And Lucy Winkett, my boss, who's priest in charge at St Pancras, will also be a speaker this year. So do come. Another thing is, I've heard there's no trains today from Manchester into London. Was anybody trying to get back to London today? Are you all local? Well, that's all right then. I'm driving locally, so it's okay. Just wanted to let you know. Thank you. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I've got a bad voice. I've lost my voice. So my question just an addition of how we can move forward. I said my background is Pentecostal, and I will say that women were not being marginalized, we're seen. And I think what we do is we don't just sit back and listen. If you walk into a Pentecostal church today, you find that we have more women than men in church. And with that number, we take advantage of that to say, how can we start planting? So in the Pentecostal, we've got women who can be ordained to go out and plant a church because we have proven that we can do it. We are the pillars, we hold the homes, and we believe that we can talk to God even more and God listen to the voice of the women even more. So I think we need to put it more in this area. It's enough of women sitting down in the Catholic churches and the Anglican churches. It's more of doing the work now. A lot has been said. Well, I want to advise that when we go back, let's start more in our own little way, in our little community. Aside from offering coffee and tea, let's try to build up ourselves. And there will be a point when the number of men will reduce, and there will be the opportunity for women to stand up.
Can I just ask a question of the room? Because women in the church has been active for a really long time.
Women in the church has been active for a really long time, and I think recently younger women have gone, oh no, they're not speaking to me. And I think part of the reason is because they're being really bullshit, because they've decided they've got to campaign for change. And it's like, oh yeah, but I've got to get on with my colleagues who disagree. And I'm just interested as to why they've got few supporters. Sorry, Jenny.
5 guiding principles.
I know, but you know,
I think they've silenced women, so they're too scared to join something like Watch or Speak Out with Watch because the framework doesn't allow them to do it.
We were silenced at All Saints. We were basically told this is what it says, no point discussing it, don't.
I suppose I just want to say, sorry, while I've got a microphone, I'll shout over you, because that's what we do. I just want to say, maybe think about it, because it's actually not taking a huge risk to join the organisation, and they are, their strapline is not equal yet, and they're really fighting for it, and they're getting more people on board actually. So I just encourage you to look at it for yourselves and think about it for yourselves. There is a campaigning organisation, they're working really hard. I was a trustee, I'm not anymore, but I think it's really important to just give them a look before you assume there's nobody doing this work, because they really are.
I don't know if there are any last minute comments, or we're about 10 to 4 and we finish on time.
Liz, Bishop Sarah's on our website.
Oh yes, yeah, Bishop Sarah's talk is on the St Pancras Church website. Which tab is it under?
Good question. It might still be on the Women's Voices Conference, but you will find it on the YouTube site for St Pancras Church used to.
Yeah, okay. So
Don't mix us up with St Pancras Church that only has men in ministry. Very small building with a much bigger building.
yeah, so look out for that. There will be another Women's Voices in Manchester next year. Let's make it even bigger. And thank you very much for coming and being here and being part of the day. Thanks especially to our speakers, to Lisa and Hannah, to Maggie and Rachel, and to Kate. Everybody? Yeah. Oh, and Jenny, of course. Yeah, sorry, Jenny. Oh, she's sitting under my nose. Sorry, Jenny, you opened it. Is your paper going to be available or anything? Are you going to? Yeah. Oh, that's your Jenny. Yeah, so thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you in either in London or in Liverpool or in 12 months' time.